Specimens, revealing the network of collectors and determiners of bat specimens. My name is David Shorthouse. You just heard from Deb Paul earlier and Nancy Simmons here. So the three of us have been, among other folk here that you'll see in a moment, I've been trying to get a session together about what it is that we're going to be doing for the next little while. So here are all of you that have registered. You may not all be here at the moment, but clearly we already have a network. Over on the right here, you'll see some additional facilitators for this workshop. Asia, Trevor, Erica, Katie, and a Wikipedian who has joined us from New Zealand at 4 o'clock in the morning, Siobhan Leachman, pardon me, Siobhan, will give us a rundown of why we're going to be using Wikidata as part of our workflow. And we'll hear more from her a little later today. So to give you a bit of background of the scope of where this workshop emerged, earlier in the summer, a grant was awarded to a number of folk at Florida State University to develop a vetted, georeferenced, consolidated data product for the horseshoe bats and related species to, beef up what we know in the specimen record about these bat species. And so for the past month or so, the team has been enhancing the georeferencing, tidying up some of the data sets that have emerged from GBIF and IDIG-Bio. And part of this workshop today is to continue with that enhancement process. If you've not yet had an opportunity to see this YouTube presentation, this was presented to the TADWIG group, or the Taxonomic Databases Working Group, also commonly known as the Biodiversity Information Standards Group, to give more details about the scope of this grant and the intent of what will emerge from these data products as the end of the cycle progresses. So I encourage you to seek out that YouTube channel and have a look at that. It's about an hour and a half long, but it's well worth your while. Part of the scope of what we intend to do fits very nicely in a relatively new idea that has emerged within the collections community in particular, about this idea of an extended specimen network. How is it that you can connect a digital object such as a specimen datum to all the peripheral kinds of data that might be relevant to develop some inferences that wouldn't otherwise be possible unless you made some connections between place, people, etc., that might allow new questions to be asked that wouldn't otherwise be possible. And in parallel to that, in the EU, there's another program developed by DISCO, the Distributed System of Scientific Collections, that are also thinking about this idea of a digital specimen and making connections to other resources in a more machine readable way that would allow, again, more inferences to be made. So if we step back a little bit and think about what it means to have a digital specimen, whether it be a bat, or whether it be a plant, whether it be an insect. In the biological sciences, and this is some thought that a colleague of mine in the past named David Patterson, who was once a commissioner for the ICZN, was thinking about the biological sciences in general, about what makes it peculiar and different from all the other sciences. And there are a number of key integrators that connect a lot of our products in the biological sciences. So we can think of these as time, place, and scientific names. And here I've got Darwin's sketch here to remind you that scientific names are key parts in developing any kind of informatics framework and how you put all these pieces together. But so too are people. We live our lives, we scatter little breadcrumbs about ourselves, whether we choose to or not. Items such as our birth dates, our death dates, where we've lived, where we've worked, all can corroborate those other connections such as the time and place and scientific names that could enhance our science in a way that could be really quite interesting, engaging new communities as well. So what's our immediate goal for this workshop? Given this background of what it means to connect things from one item to another. Well, what we really want to do is to link all the digitally available bat specimens, and in this particular workshop, it's to be the Rhinolophids and the Hipposideridae, to the collectors and the determiners of those specimens. And what we might be doing as in a course of getting underway with this workshop is revealing errors or inconsistencies in transcription. We might identify issues where if we knew something about the individual person, the collector or the determiner, we might pinpoint some issues with the way in which those specimen data have been produced. And of course, we're going to be enhancing that rapid data product as part of this grant in this process as an outcome. And what might be of interest to most of you is, what would it take to make a list of experts, living or deceased, for the bats that we're focusing on today? One way you could do that is to troll through the scientific literature and pull out name strings of people and trying to make a list that way. So you'd wind up with a dirty bucket, and then you try and sort out who those individuals are and curate it as best you can. And of course, another way of doing that is through the specimen data themselves. But not all of us will know these bat collectors or determiners, and that would probably include a lot of you here. When looking through this dirty bucket list that we're about to present to you, there will be names in there you just absolutely no idea, no clue. But quite a number of them you will, and this is partly the reason why you're here, is you are the folks that will know who these individuals are. So why should we link people to biodiversity data? And I've been thinking about this for quite a number of years, and there's a number of ways in which you can think about this scope. The one which is the most immediately obvious is to give credit or recognition to individuals that have been responsible for developing our natural history collections. And I draw your attention to a paper that I always refer to time and time again, put out by Lucinda McDade and her colleagues in 2011 in Bioscience, describing why and how the biological sciences need a modern assessment system. So it's not driven entirely by publications, but all the other products that are produced as in the course of doing our science, such as specimens, submissions to GenBank, et cetera, that would be wonderful if we could pool all of those products together in a modern assessment system, such that when you go up for tenure, you have an opportunity to present the breadth of all your activities, not entirely limited to publications. So why also might you want to link people to biodiversity data? Well, clearly there's a history of science component to this. There's also the opportunity to produce new science and to think about ways in a much more creative way about how we might approach our science by thinking about the connections between person and their data products. So we might facilitate new discoveries. And obviously it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's a gateway to linking other items, field notes, publications, sequences, et cetera, all might have tags of people's names on them. So it's an opportunity to discover other items, other products that people have produced that might bring to bear the enhancement of the particular data item that you're interested in. And obviously we could detect errors or fill gaps, and interestingly, as I've been learning over the past little while with a project that I'll describe in a moment, is that it's a real opportunity to engage with new local and international audiences, such as the genealogists. And so there's an opportunity there to really make our science widely known to whole new communities. So this business of linking person to data, or linking all other data items together in some kind of linked open network, really falls along this principle of FAIR, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And how is it that people might be contributing to this FAIR principle? And so here is the first bit of jargon that I'm going to present to you that might become quite obvious as we continue with this workshop, is what is a person and what is an agent string? Well, for the purpose of this workshop, we're defining a person in this context as a human with an open, verifiable, and shared digital identifier. So in this case here, I give you an example of Michael Carleton. There's his ORCID identifier, which I'll describe in a moment. And an agent string, on the other hand, is nothing more than a string of characters purported to represent a person, so obviously represents a person in some way, and it might be lifted from the transcription of a specimen label, but without a link to a digital identifier. So in other words, if you were to remove this agent string out of its context, you would have absolutely no idea who that person might be. M. Carleton could be Michelle Carleton. Whereas a person in this context, Michael Carleton, has this ORCID identifier. So out of curiosity, I went through the Global Biodiversity Information Facility and lifted out all the number of records of bats that I could find. So I've got all the families there listed on the left, and all the specimen records, or purported to be specimen records, what GBIF will tend to call occurrences, over on the right. And if you additionally parse through all of those specimen records and lift out all what I'm calling the agent strings and of the collectors and determiners, don't yet know who these people are because they're not yet linked to an identifier, you get somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 of these strings of purported people in the roughly 80,000 very dirty records that might have come from GBIF for the two families that we're looking at today, the Hipposideridae and the Rhinolophidae. So part of our task in this workshop, in addition to thinking about making a master list of all the world's experts of these two families of bats, is to turn strings to things. The agent string, the person M. Carleton, to a semantic web-ready URI, which is nothing, a fancy way of saying it's a URL. In this case, it's ORCID. And why are we doing this? Well, it's to build the linked open network, to inject people into that linked open network such that we can do some pretty interesting inferences that wouldn't otherwise be possible if all what we're doing is looking at an agent string. So here is the first view of one of the spreadsheets that we're going to share with you today. Here is the dirty list of all of the agents that we've lifted from GBIF in those two families of bats. And so we've given the title of these columns agent given name or agent family name. And those have emerged from having parsed the raw specimen data from GBIF. And there's a notes column there that we've, prior to this workshop, many of us have got together to try and write little notes. Do we know this person? Who might this be? Could there be a link out to Wikidata? Could there be a link out to ORCID? Some, these identifiers for other people. Any little bits of notes that we can come up with there to try and disambiguate who these agent strings are in relation to their person as an identity as defined with having an identifier for them. So part of your task today was have a look at this, and we'll share this out with you momentarily. To see if you recognize any names there, write little notes. That will help us immensely. And of course, you are the experts. You know this more than anyone else within our community. And you'll notice that there's some garbage in here, clearly, because having gone through with a bit of programming and regular expressions to pull out these agent names, they're not people names at all. They just were caught in the net of the occasional mess that appears in GBIF in the collector name or the determiner name. And so just ignore those. It's an expedition. That's not a person, or something weird happened here. Just that's not a person. And that will help us immensely as well. And in addition to that, prior to this workshop, we've come up with a clean list, the known people. So the spreadsheet that we'll share has two sheets in it, the dirty list of agents and the clean list of people. And here we have some links directly out to identifiers for these individuals as one column, and another column here to give you a direct link into a major part of this workshop. So that get you underway, get your feet wet, figure out how this process is going to work. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So identifier systems for people. What do we use? How are we going to hang an identifier off a person? And what is the most logical ones that we might want to use? We've got some criteria for these. It must be open. The metadata must be openly created and edited or removed by anyone. It has open tools and modern services so that some machine programming can tap into these identifiers and pull out some metadata about these people in an open environment. We don't want to build a resource that is completely insular to the bats or any other group of taxa. We want to take advantage of what is already available out in the open and make sure that we have the opportunity to make use of other organizations that do this quite well. And so some other criteria, it ought to be centralized, financially and technically sustainable, machine readable, as I mentioned, and widely usable for other purposes well beyond what we're thinking of here. So really take advantage of what is available. And so if I know a number of you are enthusiasts of iNaturalist, and if you did not know this already, when you set up your account in iNaturalist, you can connect to something called ORCID. And part of its processes is when those observational data then appear at the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, you'll have a link to you as your ORCID ID in that record in GBIF. So if you've not yet done this in iNaturalist, I encourage you to do so. So here's GBIF. Here is what we're playing with. So all the data that you're going to be looking at throughout this workshop have emerged directly from GBIF. And I'll talk more about that a little later and how that works with the project that you're going to be interacting with. So ORCID. This is one of the identifier systems that we're going to make very strong use of. If you do not yet have one, I strongly encourage that you do. You go out and get one, and we'll provide some instructions here in a moment. ORCID is a persistent identifier that's been used primarily in the research community. So if you've submitted a manuscript to a journal in the past, say 5-6 months, if not a little bit longer, you might have been encouraged to make this thing called an ORCID. So you may already have one already and just have not used it in any other way except to submit a manuscript or to submit a grant application, or it's commonly used as well. So if you don't yet have one, please do go out and get one. You can jumpstart this as you're listening to me if you wish to go to orcid.org. So ORCID is limited to the living. You can't have an ORCID for someone who has passed away. And so how do we deal with that with specimen data, where the vast majority of all the records and the people that we know about are going to be deceased? Well, here's where we take advantage of yet another identifier system in a much more open, flexible way with Wikidata. This is one of the sister projects to Wikipedia, but is dramatically different from Wikipedia. You can think of Wikidata as having a series of statements about items. When were they born? When were they die? Where do they work? Et cetera, as factual statements with supporting evidence that you can include in those factual statements to really beef up the veracity of those statements being made. And so why not use Wikidata for the deceased? It seems like a logical choice. So some near-term goals and other possible outcomes from this workshop. So if you're going to go through the business of trying to connect a person, either having an ORCID identifier or a Wikidata identifier to a specimen record as what might have emerged from GBIF, what might you envision doing with that process that kind of engages the collections community, thinking about this in a much more flexible way? Well, clearly what we'd want to do is, having made these connections, is for this to roll right back into the collections data. There's no sense making this completely dissociated from the specimens. We've got to close that loop, put it right back into the specimen data to make sure that there's going to be the long-term care for these associations between specimen and identity. And while doing so, we could think about tools and services that might facilitate that process even more. So this project that I'm going to describe in a moment that I launched a couple of years ago has these things built into it that might facilitate searching for people. So OpenRefine, if you've used that, there's an endpoint for OpenRefined in this project I'm going to describe, such that you can do some of that reconciliation of people names on the fly in that data cleaning environment. And likewise, how about a little widget that you might be able to include in your collections management system or elsewhere where you could, begin typing a person's name, and that will pop up a little description of who they are, whether they're living, and to kind of facilitate the cognitive effort of making a link between a person and a specimen, knowing, a little snippet that might come up within the environment that you're working in. That would be a wonderful kind of outcome to really kind of help close this loop of where transcription happens. And I hope what also comes from this, and then as you're thinking about this process, is use it as a means to begin telling stories. And think about what kind of visualizations you might kind of develop or think about that would help you tell stories. And that's, I'm very keen to learn about that, because this is the project that you'll be working on this morning, or at least this morning for me. It might be very early or very late in the evening for you. It's called Bionomia. This is a project I launched a few years ago that enables the linking between person, as defined as having a Wikidata, a Q number as it's called, or an ORCID identifier, and a GBIF specimen across the board, all taxa. And I've seeded this with a number of entries that already exist in ORCID, a number of entries that already exist in Wikidata, and allow you to open it up to the world to log in using your ORCID identifier and your permissions with ORCID, such that you can be presented immediately with your name and the likely specimens that you collected or have been responsible for, and claim them as part of your identity, and, the effort that you've gone through, and likewise attribute them to other people. And so this has grown very quickly, very enthusiastically over the past couple of years, and that's really quite inspirational for me. So a number of you have done this already. It's wonderful. So here's Kendra. She's gone through the process of having done this already, logged into Bionomia with her ORCID credentials, found her specimens, and say, yep, I collected that one, I identified that one, and up comes some little summary, a little map of where you were. Links out to potential publications that have also used her specimens, which I think is really kind of interesting as well. Adam has also done that. If Adam, you're here, I watched your brain scoop video a couple of months ago with my 7-year-old dissecting a skunk, and it was amazing. So thank you very much for having done that. Adam has gone through this as well. Kudos to Adam. And Cody also has done this, if you're here, Cody. You'll notice on the bottom left, Cody has done something kind of interesting. Here's this DOI. So one of the features in Bionomia is if you go through the effort of kind of saying, yep, that's my specimen, I collected that one, I identified that one, what can you do with that? Well, one thing you might do with that is to link it up in a couple of clicks to a long-term repository called Zenodo. So a snapshot that gets versioned as you continue to work in Bionomia. I give you a DOI, a little citation for that effort that you can stuff in your CV. So if those of you who've got graduate students here and thinking about how you might give your graduate students a boost and pad their CVs with some of the products that they have produced, whether that be specimen data, please do alert them to this capability within Bionomia. I'd love to see them use this in their CVs. So what about the deceased? Well, here's our Harry Hoogstraal. Deb and I, and perhaps a few others, have gone through the effort of linking Harry to his specimens. And so when you do this through Wikidata, I've pulled in some very key and interesting elements that are present in Wikidata, such as Harry's birth date and death date. And what could you do with that? Well, why not cross-reference that against the dates collected or identified? And sure enough, then you can reveal some inconsistencies in the specimen data. So here I've highlighted Harry's birth and death date and queried on the fly some problems. Well, Harry's got some specimens now linked to him that were clearly collected before he was born, some after he died, and that's a problem. And so we need to alert folk in the collections community that although this is quite likely Harry, there's a problem in the transcription of those specimen data. And so there's another loop that we're trying to close with the collections community. Go back, look at those specimens. Something is funky here. Were you going to say something there, Deb?
Oh, I was just laughing. I did go through and claim most of those, and then I hesitated, like, well, it's got to be him because how many hairy hookstrals are there? So you know
Right.
there's something wrong with the record, but it probably very much is him. But yes, so
Yeah, that's right.
it's
You're going to
amusing.
see that when you start looking through some of these records from GBIF. Warts and all have appear in GBIF data, and Bionomia pulls all the specimen data from GBIF. And so one of your exercises might be, if it's of interest to you, to jot down some little notes in our shared notes within the agenda. You know, perhaps as a reminder to some folk, or whether or not you want to go back and have a look at that one, use that as a free-flowing note-taking exercise. But like I said, you know, some of this can be done in a machine readable way. And so, you know, clearly we can use the birth and death dates on the fly, and that's kind of built into Bionomia. And we can share that back to the collections community, and they are beginning to make use of this, which is encouraging. So last week, I think it was last week, I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if I could make family pages for the Rhinolophids and the Hipposideridae, and among all other taxa that might be present in GBIF. And here's here's one kind of view of this. So not necessarily looking at the collector and the determiner, but start, your trajectory into this workflow from the families themselves. And you can find that in the upper part of the navigation panel in Bionomia, and do a search for those families, and up come the list of the known collectors that have already been linked to the specimens within those families. And here for the Rhinolophids, we've got 72. So a modest start, but clearly there will be more by the time this workshop comes to a close, and likely the Hipposideridae. So here you see one tab here called agent strings. So this is another cue to you. So the people, these are the ones that have the identifiers, and the agent strings is the dirty bucket. We don't yet know who these folk are, or they're not yet been linked to the specimens. So ORCID, your first task number 1. If you do not have an ORCID, please go get one. And it's https://orcid.org. And I make some recommendations here, what you should put in that. Your AKA names, your also known as names, or your aliases. If your name has appeared in publications with abbreviations, it'd be great if you could put those in your AKA names. If you remarried, change your name, or you change your name for whatever other reason, please also put that in your also known as names. Your employment and education, your country, keywords, websites, other identifiers, and if you're ambitious, you could start linking some of your publications if you've not yet done so. Some of that information will get drawn immediately into Bionomia. So your AKA names and your employment and education and your country will get drawn into Bionomia and used, oh, pardon me, somebody is attempting to call. I have a little one who was in the hospital a couple of weeks ago, and so the hospital is trying to follow up with an appointment. Apologies. He's okay, but it was a bit of a scare for my family, but I'll let that ring. Hopefully they'll leave a message. So anyway, go to ORCID, fill in your details there. It will get drawn into Bionomia when you use your ORCID credentials to then log in. And so whatever you make public in your ORCID account will get drawn into Bionomia in that list that you just saw. Anything you choose to leave private in ORCID as you choose will not be drawn into Bionomia. And you can refresh what Bionomia knows about your ORCID account at any time. So you make any updates in ORCID, click the refresh button there in Bionomia, and that'll get updated. If you choose to hide something at some point in the future, refresh it in Bionomia, it will similarly be hidden. So that's the nice thing about ORCID, is that it's completely open in that sense, and it's your choice whether or not you want to hide particular items. So your task number 2 then is to log into Bionomia with your ORCID credentials. You don't necessarily have to go to ORCID if you don't yet have one to make your account there first. You could do that sort of on the fly into Bionomia, but what you won't have an opportunity to do is kind of flesh out some of the other details about yourself in ORCID unless you kind of do that step first before logging in. And so what you get presented immediately is a series of tabs in your profile, one of which is going to be your candidate specimens, the things that might be yours because they match your name or your aliases in some way. And so the first exercise might be to say, yep, that's the one I collected, or that's the one I identified. You can do that in bulk in the screen that you see. So the little collecting net there on the left will be, you know, your indication that you collected that one. The microscope there would be you identified that one, or both, saying you both collected it and identified that one. And so there'll be other columns in the sheets that get, in the views that get presented to you, that will give you some cues of you know, when it was collected. And so all the data that might have come from GBIF. But clearly there'll be some items in there that are not you at all. There's just been kind of poor logic perhaps at play in Bionomia that kind of tagged you as the potential collector or determiner. And so you say, there's over on the right, when you first look at that, and be a column there saying, no, it's not me, not me. Ignore that one. So the next time I then go refresh GBIF data, because I do it every 2 weeks in Bionomia, just to keep up to date what's happening in GBIF, you're not going to be presented with those specimen records again. They'll be hidden in perpetuity. And so here's me. When I log in, as you will too, there'll be a settings and integrations link at the bottom of your profile. What you can then do is make your profile public or not in Bionomia. I mean, I strongly suggest that you do go through this exercise of having claimed much of your specimens to then make your profile public, but it is absolutely your choice, just as it is in ORCID to make some items hidden. So optional task number 1. Here are one of our breakout rooms. The strings in that Google sheet that will be shared are the agent strings that have given names and family names and note columns. Here are a number of folk who we just don't know who they are. And so if this is of interest to you, and one of the optional tasks in our breakout room for strings is to write little notes in there, little notes to self or little notes to everyone else. Put your name in brackets or your initials in brackets there. So if, you know, the rest of us can see who it was that might have made that little note. It'd be lovely if you could find a link or a URL out to somewhere else that would give an indication of who these people are. So if you found an ORCID for these people, wonderful. If you found a Wikidata entry for these agent strings, wonderful. Or ResearchGate, whatever it is that you think you might find that would give us some clues as to who these individuals are. And an optional task number 2, the other breakout room, are the things. And the things being the people we know about, the people that have an identifier, either an ORCID or a Wikidata. So in the second sheet, within this Google sheet, you'll see a number of very simple columns, a list of person's name, a link out to the direct page in Bionomia where you begin claiming or attributing the specimens to those individuals. And another column in here, I've wired up a real-time progress indicator that will show you, well, it looks like this person's, you know, profile is pretty much complete. I'll skip that one. But others are just underway a little bit, a little green bar there just to say it started, but, you know, there's a whole much more work to do there. And another column in there for claimant, that's you. So if you want to jump the gun and say, well, I know this person immediately and I would really love to go and attribute some of the specimens to them, put your name and claimant as you stake your ground there. You want to get underway with that. So Deb, maybe I should hand this over to you. Do you want me to use these slides here?
Yeah.
And then I'll just, you tell me when you want to advance. Does that work?
Sure, it'll be fine. So first I'd like to say again, thank you and welcome. And I hope now we're gonna get to the part where you guys get to actually start doing something. And so I give you a few examples. And I thought I would do a live demo, David, but I just want to go through these slides very quickly.
Sure.
So very quickly here, this is what a page is going to look like for you inside Bionomia. So this is from the spreadsheet we're going to share. I decided I would work on this Glover, Morrill, Allen, and I clicked the link in the spreadsheet. So you'll be able to go directly from the spreadsheet into Bionomia, assuming you are logged in and you did task number 1, as David explained. But now when we look at this, we see that Bionomia is guessing. It says, I think there are 17,000 specimens that might be Glovers. And you can see where that in the green bar where it says help attribute 17,000 specimens. And so then we can decide, is this Glover or not? And did Glover collect the specimen? Did Glover identify the specimen? Or is this not Glover at all? And did the software guess incorrectly? So for the first line, we can see that's a collecting net on the left. We can say that looks to be right, which is to say the name is correct. How many Glover Morrill Allens could there possibly be? The date collected is 1913. If you look at on the top right, you'll see this in Bionomia. The dates of birth and death mean that that's reasonable, that that was the right person. Maybe you know a lot more about this person than I do, and you would know whether or not they really did collect a gecko of some sort here. For our practical purposes, I call your attention to the right-hand side of the screen, to the green bar, where it says Advanced Search and Filter. You may not have time today to go through 17,000 records one by one, but instead you could just look for the Rhinolophidae and the Hipposideridae that might be collected by Glover. So the next slide, please. So I have gone to the Advanced Search Filter feature. I typed in Rhinolophidae, clicked Apply, and now I only see 16 specimens, which I can then easily either evaluate one row by each row, clicking on the net or clicking on the microscope, the dissecting scope for identified, for example, or both if the person's name is in both columns. And you can also do the entire page. If you look at all 16 and they're all him, you can click the appropriate buttons at the top under bulk assignment there on the left-hand side of the screen. You can also help out if it's obviously a whole page worth, for example, of not Glover Morrill Allen. On the right-hand side, you can click not them so that those won't be presented to someone else to evaluate if they decide to work on Glover Morrill Allen, and they won't have to make those decisions all over again. In the future, if you have time, let's say there were, 1,000 to do. If you look under Glover Morrill Allen's name on the left-hand side of the slide, you see discovered, fixed attributions, reclaim ignored, and bulk attributions. I can show you quickly, but essentially if you click on bulk attributions, you would be able to download a spreadsheet, work on them easily on your desktop, and then upload the results back to Bionomia. Next slide. So once you're done, you need to make them public, or the outside world doesn't know that this has been done and that we can't see the profile page. And so with someone's name under Andre Brosset on the right, looking down under his name near the bottom of the yellow square, you see a little make public and a little lock. When you click make public, you get a tweet that says, hey, Andre Brosset collected Hipposideridae and Rhinolophidae, and it makes a tweet out to the world. And it also then makes the profile public, so then we can go and look and see where around the world and where through time and with whom and how many publications specimens collected by Andre Brosset have been included. Next slide. And consider if you are working on people who are currently on the planet today, especially when you're also working on yourself, that you have to make your profile public. You notice here there's no make public. This is a live person. And so clicking refresh updates your information. So if Jody Sedlock goes into ORCID and adds that they're also known as J Sedlock, or maybe have a middle initial, and then they were to click refresh, then those details and things would potentially show up here. But again, when you're a live person, only you can let David know that it's okay to make your profile public, or you can do that. I see lots of conversations in the chat. That's it, I think, right, David? Do I have one more slide?
It is, yeah,
I think
that's right.
that's the end. Yay.
Well, well, you had this one here too, I think.
Oh, yes.
And
So, okay, so this is where, could Katie or someone, please put the link to the working list of agents in the chat. I think everybody's probably discovered it by now because it's in your working agenda. But this bit.ly link to the working list of agents, someone could pop that into the chat. That would be lovely. Yep, someone's doing it. Thanks. So in this sheet that you are going to open at the moment, you're going to see two tabs. So just give you a second to open it. So now that you have it open, the known people tab, these are people who we've already added their ORCID or their Wikidata ID to Bionomia. So by this, on this sheet, you can claim a line. You can say, I want to work on Burton limb. So you can go to row 8, go over to the claimant column I, put your name in there and your initials, please. And then click the link in column E where it says Bionomia helping URL. So if you click that, once you're logged into Bionomia, that takes you directly to the specimens. It'll look just like the slides we went through, and you'd be able to start saying, yes, that specimen was collected by Burton limb, or yes, that specimen was identified by Burton limb, or no, that's not Burton limb. Then you can do that, and the more you do that, the progress bar is going to change. At the end of the day, we'll be able to see how far we got today, but you can work on this anytime. So we're hoping you will take this on yourself and also share it with colleagues to help us. Then, and the next slide, this is the last one, I think.
Yeah.
Yep, so this is the other, if you want to help us, we need you. These are name strings for which we don't know who they are. These are the strings that David was referring to. So an example here would be on line, which is the one I picked out here on purpose? Oh yes, M. Baddeley. There's a B-A-D-D-E-L-E-Y and B-A-D-D-L-E-Y. We can see the collection date of the specimens, but we don't know what the M stands for. We don't know if those two people are the same person or not, but maybe you know right away that that's Michael, maybe, or Michelle, or Mary, or something, but we don't. But you, because of your personal knowledge, may know who that is or know where to go to look. So your task is to fill out column C. Tell us something about that person. If you don't put a link to a source on the web, then we're going to assume that's personal knowledge. So if somebody types in there, Michelle Baddeley, we're going to assume that came out of your head. So please put information in there and then put your initials. If you have a source document that you're referring to on the web, please put a link to that. And then we will use that information later. Trevor, Asia, and Katie, who are with us today, and they are our data curators on this grant that David described, they'll be taking that information and creating Wikidata pages and then going into Bionomia and adding the people to Bionomia. And that's what we need your help with today. Now we have time for questions, and we have breakout rooms that will be set up as well to be open all day for help if you want to step back in and you want help. And then at the end of the day, we'll be at 3 p.m. Eastern time, coming back together in order to see how far we got and to talk about what we might be doing next with all the work that we've done. We also have a lovely opportunity for you to learn more about the Wikidata piece of all of this and why it's important and how it works, as we have Wikipedian Siobhan Leachman with us, and she got up at 4 in the morning to join us. And she'll also be back at later this afternoon in an optional session if you want to come back and learn the Wikidata chunk of this. That's it. Questions? Yes.
So I want to make one comment about Siobhan, and thank you for joining us, Siobhan. Siobhan has been one of the stalwarts, one of the shining lights within this whole process in Bionomia, among many other citizen science projects. And kudos to her for revealing to the rest of us who don't think about the importance of linking one item to another. But clearly it has benefit well beyond our immediate uses. And so I strongly encourage you, as you begin working through this dirty list of agents in that spreadsheet that Deb just talked about, and saying, oh yes, I know who that Michelle is, and write a little note to yourself. It's possible that those individuals might not yet exist in Wikidata, and they're clearly deceased, because the dates of collections are, the 1800s or the early 1900s. And it's quite likely that you'll want to jump straight into start claiming specimens in Bionomia, but you can't yet because that person is not yet a person. It's an agent string that could hopefully have a Wikidata page. And Siobhan's going to show you how that will work and how that process will work. And recall way back earlier in this presentation, I said the point of using ORCID and Wikidata is so that these are wide out in the open and used well beyond our immediate purposes. And so I strongly encourage you to come back 2 o'clock Eastern Standard in the main room here in Zoom to learn about Wikidata and how that will work. So behind the scenes, what I'm going to be doing is monitoring activities, and I'm going to do a little query at the end of this workshop just to give us our own depiction of how well we did. And I'll, if I'm feeling ambitious, I might make a wall of shame for all of us and say, okay, well, how well did we do here? And who was the shining star here and made a lot of these connections? And so I'll, without pointing any fingers, I hope, I can show you, how quickly some of this can actually happen. As you're claiming specimens in Bionomia or attributing to others, I wouldn't be too overly concerned about comprehensiveness. I mean, it is equally important to, claim or attribute a few, because that will help, right? The next person that might come along will have a look at this and say, okay, well, look at those ones that were attributed. Now I have a bit more context of who this person is. I can see that they collected in that list of other little co-collectors or agent strings and say, okay, well, they clearly collect with those folk. So I know other records, when I come across them, it's quite likely them because the same co-collector is listed, right? So there's lots of little mental games that play here with this whole process. So don't be too concerned about comprehensiveness. What we're aiming for here is just to get your feet wet and to enable others to get underway as well, and doing it more comprehensively at some point in the future.
So thanks for listening to all that so we can get it connected. We have a hand up and we have some questions, and y'all be patient, please, just a second, be kind, because I see that we have to catch up through what we were talking about. So if I missed your question or get it out of order, I apologize in advance. I see Gabor Zorba. By the way, they have a new grant he can tell you more about in the EU that's going to do digitization of these same bat families, and hopefully this work is going to benefit them as well. So it's not just about this, but it's about this larger world that David alluded to. Gabor asks, David, any standards for non-English names? For example, the family name is not evident for Vietnamese, and Myanmar names have no family or given name distinctions.
Yeah, there are some really interesting and problematic ways in which people's names are represented. And there's a W3 standard for how best to do this. And the short answer is having nothing more than just a full name is clearly going to be of most use across the breadth of all cultures. There's obviously a Western bias in the spreadsheets that we've put together here for you with a given name and family name, but clearly that doesn't apply in all instances. The beauty of Wikidata is that you can put all of that in there. And the way in which names are represented in Bionomia, although they tend to be stored as given name and first name, I do my best not to completely expose that in that way in all instances. It's used predominantly as a supplement to search as opposed to being the correct way to represent the name. So having a whole suite of aliases associated with the person's name is equally important as well. So if the name is represented in other cultures and other languages, Wikidata is an immensely powerful tool to handle precisely those things.
Yes, and some of that exactly. There's two more questions. One maybe a short answer. Can Wikidata also link to ORCID and connect data from one to the other? Interesting.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So if you have an ORCID ID and you've gone through the process of making your ORCID account, it won't be immediate, but what will happen behind the scenes is a lot of Wikidata bots that will go scouring through ORCID and pulling that information and making a Wikidata item for you, whether you know it or not, because your name and your ORCID ID has appeared out in public in ORCID. And that whole process will begin in Wikidata. So yes, there's a good chance that you already have a Wikidata item for you, just as you may have an ORCID ID for yourself. And so you can link a Wikidata item to that ORCID account. And just as you might have a link out to some other identifier, the botanists have got lots of identifiers for themselves, and you can make those linkages there as well. That help?
Yep, I think so. People have to tell in the chat if it helped. Be aware with ORCID, one needs to set the profile as accessible and ascertain you select one default email account. Yes, there are definitely people who end up having for a variety of reasons more than one ORCID. That's a different challenge. Try not to do that to yourself. Paul Harrison, you have your hand up. Can you unmute yourself and jump in, please?
Yes. It seems to give the impression that most specimens are collected by one person, but I would say that most specimens are not collected by one person, they're collected by a team. So how does that work?
So the botanists have done this relatively well. And you think of the Harvard Index of Botanists, or the HUH, have storing, in addition to the individuals, but the team membership. So the team and also the individuals within that team. I've waffled how best to represent that in Bionomia. I think it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. If you've got a list of individuals as part of a team, that might appear as using the GBIF jargon, recorded by, which is the home for the list of collectors. There might be 5, 6 individuals listed there, and what would happen in Bionomia is the opportunity to connect each of those individuals as collectors to that specimen record. So there's no notion of a team in Bionomia, but rather the individual can be independently linked to that same specimen. And so, you could, by default, make a team, having gone through the exercise of made those connections, but the team in and of itself is not stored as an independent entity. Does that make sense?
Kind of. So if I say, okay, this is my specimen like this, but then I'm thinking, but there's other people on this, even today, or I've seen their names, who were equally there. Can they? So you're saying they could also claim the specimen. So more than one person can say, yes, this is my specimen. Is that correct? I see some nodding going.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, yeah. That's precisely how it works. But you've highlighted some interesting nuances there in the way in which our data have been published from collections and then appearing on GBIF and then getting rolled into Bionomia and refreshed every once in a while. Although only one individual might be listed on that specimen, you may know, you've got some insider knowledge that, there were other members in that collecting party that were not listed on that specimen. And so it's quite feasible then that you could claim a specimen as not clearly yours because it's not listed on the data that might have come and what you see on the screen, but you were there, right? You were collecting with that individual at that time. And so there's nothing preventing you from searching for an alternate agent string within Bionomia and say, okay, well, I know I collected with so-and-so. I'm going to search on their name and then collect those, and tag those specimens and link them to yourself. The unfortunate thing is that there's no secondary process to re-verify that in any machine readable sense. But you've made that declaration, and so clearly there's a reason for having done that. But that's, it circles back to our best practices in collections and how those data appear out in the wild. I hope I didn't muddy the waters by just saying that.
I think we kind of answered your question, Paul. I do think there's, you can see in the record I'm sharing right now, for this one, there are 2 names in collected by. And if somebody's working on Glover Morrill Allen, they're probably going to see this record. If somebody's working on John C. Phillips, they would also see this record.
Right. So they don't get removed. Right. So the message here is they don't get removed from the global pool, right? So it's not like you've made a really hard link and that record then immediately disappears for everyone else. And you can't then make a connection to John C. Phillips. You could equally see this very same record in John C. Phillips' page and make that attribution there as well.
Yeah. But it is a different question too that Paul asked about, what if you see a specimen where your name isn't there, but you were on that collecting event? Or how do you share multiple names? And you'll see on some of these, it'll say like expedition. We don't know who the people were necessarily, but sometimes, and Chauvin knows this well, sometimes you will find a nice page where somebody's listed all the people that went on the expedition. So it's something to think about in the future. How could you link that sort of information, right, to those particular specimens? So we are at the hour that we asked you to join us for and explain the tasks. And we're happy to have you stay with us. We're going to have these breakout rooms, which already exist. One of them is this main room here for help. One of them is if you're going to work on the strings page, the GBIF agent strings page. The other room is those people who are going to work on people that are already in Bionomia. And they're going to click on one of those known people links in Bionomia and start claiming specimens. And so we'll have those open all day. And then we hope for those of you who are the time zone fits that you would rejoin us at 3 p.m. about 3 hours from now, 4 hours from now, for a wrap up at the end of this experience. So we can chat a bit more about the experience itself and what we do going forward. Are there other questions that I missed while I was going on? I can't see I don't see hands going up or.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Yeah, it's about the agent strings, because I think I'm going to focus on that part. I guess it's the opposite of what Paul was asking about. If I see names that are associated with auction houses or people that I know for sure did not go on the field to collect, that the specimens came to museums and through either donations or as purchases, do I make notes on that, on the agent's string datasheet?
Wow.
Because they might have been transcribed as the collector in databases, but they are not.
Okay. And I guess, Nancy, you want to weigh in on, I mean, you also found specimens that you are listed as the collector for. You want to explain that was your issue too? I don't know that we have a good answer for you on that, Roberto.
Yeah, I obviously can't claim them for that person. I had some pop up on my own Bionomia page, which were holotype and paratype of a species I named, but I did not collect them. But I was there as the determiner. That makes sense. So for some things, it just sort of I think for all of them, it automatically assumes that the person named both collected and identified it. In some cases, clearly they didn't collect it, but they may have been the one who put the name on it. I'm new to this too. I think David is probably the best one to answer some of these questions.
I guess
if it's useful to have that note. If I see the agent's string, I see that you were Edwards, which it was a taxidermist in London, beginning of the 19th century or mid-19th century. So he wasn't collecting bats, but a lot of specimens in our collections had been labeled with like his collection, and people might not have or might have interpreted that as he was the collector, but it's not. So I can make a note of that if you want me to, or I can just point you to the wiki page for that taxidermist. But I just wondered if you want me to clarify that or not. So, but I think I'll make the note and then you can decide after.
Okay, that's fine. And I think I was trying for Nancy to weigh in to also clarify, David This data, what you find in the collected by column and what you find in the identified by column is what is coming from GBIF. So this is coming from the collections as they've published it. So they're the ones who've decided what to put in those columns. And so if your name is in there and it belongs in the other column or it doesn't belong in either column, it's another trick to figure out how do we close this loop, this data feedback loop, that they would actually figure that out and do something about it. For our purposes, I'd say, of course, if you can tell us who that person is, fill out their whole name if they've only shared a partial name, so that we have some idea so that the same person doesn't have to make the same decision over and over again. That's really helpful, Roberta. Does that make sense? I think.
Yep, thank you. Well done.
Okay, are there other questions before we leave you to either work on this GBIF agent strings page or the known people? Are there questions?
I just have a quick clarifying question.
Sure, please.
If I want to work on, if I want to be a claimant to a colleague of mine who passed away, who has lots of specimens in the Philippines, but he doesn't have an ORCID number, I think you said until there's a Wikidata page for him, you really can't work on it. Is that correct? Okay, so I will not touch that.
Well,
you can ask me. It's Siobhan, the Wikidata person.
Okay.
Here. I just put his name in the chat with any links to any of his papers or anything like that, and his birth and death dates, and I can make a Wikidata item for him on the fly, rather than you guys have to wait till 2 for me to show you how to do it. I mean, I will be telling you how to do this. It's relatively easy, but yeah, I'm happy to do it so that you can work on them if you want.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Jody,
sorry.
make sure that he doesn't have an ORCID.
Yeah, I'll double check.
Because it's possible that he might have an ORCID.
Which,
Yeah,
who are we
I'll
talking
check.
about? Who are we talking about?
Danilo Balete.
Balete. Is he in our sheet at all?
Yeah, I saw him when in one of the PowerPoint slides, I saw his name as somebody without an ORCID. But I can double check.
How do you spell his last name?
Balete. His first name is Danilo, Danilo.
Right. Yeah, I don't see him in our agent string sheet, so I don't know. Did he collect rhinolophids or hipposideridae?
Oh,
Right
gosh.
there,
I
Deb.
just
Yes, many.
I'm just not seeing it. Okay. Oh, here we go.
I put his Wikidata.
Yeah, he's right there. Yep.
Oh, so he has a Wikidata page.
He has a Wikidata. Okay, great.
Which possibly means he's already in.
Should be.
So if we look at this sheet for a minute real quick, then this, if you notice on the known people, they're alphabetical by first name, Alex, Antonio, right? Here they are. And these are all the people who are still alive as far as we know. They have ORCIDs. If we go down to the page and we keep going, all of a sudden it becomes Wikidata, alphabetical. And then maybe we see, here. So on row 65, Jody, you see? So over here, you're going to put Jody, Sedlock, JS, I'm guessing. And then click on that link and you can start claiming his specimens.
Great, thanks.
I should mention in passing is that part of the reason for doing this is to not necessarily limit us to the rhinolophids and the hipposideridae. It's quite likely that a number of these folk, as you know, and you're intimate with this process, have been ornithologists, have collected a whole suite of birds. So there may be some gaps in what we know about the bat records that could be supplemented with what we know with the bird records that are very adjacent in temporally or geographically to those very same bat records. And so it's what we're going to attempt to do later on as part of this grant process is trying to explore some of those adjacent records and fill the gaps that we know about the bat records using the adjacent records that those very same collectors have produced. Hope that made sense.
Sorry, this is Emma. If I can ask a question.
It's a little bit on the left field side, and it's coming more from molecular taxonomy point of view, but how do you capture some of the data from, I would have large collections of Vespertilionid individuals, samples, wing punches taken year after year after year, or the likes of Stephen Roster would have other collections. So what do you define by a specimen, and how would you get that type of information into here as well?
You've touched on a very important point, yes. Interestingly, in GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, the data that have come out of there to appear in Bionomia and then get refreshed, there's this field of data called basis of record, which is, it's been used as in all manner of ways to represent a whole organism. It's been used to represent nothing more than a wing punch, for example, and there are lots of instances of that, and it's very difficult to disentangle whether or not it's a subsample or whether or not it's the original whole specimen, and that's an ongoing challenge at the moment. So it's quite likely that in Bionomia you're going to see some records in there that clearly are not whole organism specimens. They might be skeletal remains. They might be wing punches. And so there's no quick and easy answer for that at the moment. They're treated as nothing, what might seem to be whole specimens Bionomia, but clearly they're not in a lot of instances. And we'll disentangle that as best we can downstream.
Do you think in the future, David, though, we have better practices set up going forward yet for keeping these things linked, or as linked as possible rather than after the fact?
Yeah, you would hope, yes. I mean, that's our end goal, is to make sure that we are as clear about our presentation of data as possible. Yes, but there's still a remarkable amount of slop and ambiguity, to use some rather distasteful words, in GBIF as a result of how data are getting published.
Hey, Emma, there's one other thing here, which I think this is a much bigger problem, which is that so many molecular systematists who collect samples like that just keep them in their own freezers, and they are never cataloged into a museum collection. So what's captured here is the subsample of things that made it into GBIF. It's not going to have all the stuff that's sitting in your freezer, right? So until you archive that someplace that has a cataloging system and a permanent record keeping system and is uploading them to GBIF and records like that, they're not going to appear. They don't exist in essence.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think it's really important if we can try and link all these things together. And I really commend this. I think this is exactly what we have to do moving forward to be able to capitalize on a lot of our natural collections. And the other thing I would think about is that the idea of trying to link it to whole genomes that we're now going to sequence as a representative of a species. So we'd have a hollow genome, but we have to be able to databases. We have to know where that specimen is kept, in whose freezer, when was it collected? Is it really the true, and which population was it, to make sure this really is the appropriately named species? And I think moving the BAT1K, for example, we're now starting to really think about this, and I could see us all working together from that viewpoint. And also, where do those downstream molecular data be kept? Should the museums be where it's actually kept, so you could link it all together through the likes of Bionomia, GBIF, and so forth?
Yeah, I think we're in new territory now, and I think this notion of linking an item to another, although it's relatively mature in the publications industry with the DOIs and the literature cited sections that get all parsed out and linked up appropriately, we're still learning how best to do this in the collections community. And I think it all comes down to having a unique identifier system that is resolvable, that can be dependable and can depend on it time and time again. But the history of our standards community has been a little shaky at best in recommending the use of some identifier system and then abandoning it and then recommending new systems. What I hope that we're going to take home from this is that, people with either a Wikidata or an ORCID identifier is relatively low-hanging fruit No, it's pretty stable. It's the kind of unequivocal identifier system for people. Can we perhaps use this as a test bed to see what works, what doesn't work, and then apply that across the board to other kinds of data and entities that, whole genomes, et cetera, to really get a handle on not necessarily the technology behind it, but also the sociology behind it, because someone has to maintain this. Someone has to make the links, and you can do it in a machine way, but there's always going to be a long tail of material that we just haven't a clue. It's going to take a human. And so hopefully we can kind of learn about this in this context and apply what we learn elsewhere.
David, Paul has a question or has his hand up? Very polite, Paul. You should just jump in.
Very quickly, I think there's a lot of specimens that aren't on GBIF that are in proper collections. I mean, especially in Europe, probably. For instance, many of our specimens aren't on GBIF, but they're all catalogued. They're all not correctly identified, but identified. All with their locality data, all labelled. So, what is their role in this kind of thing? How do they get incorporated?
Well, until they have gone through the steps of having their data published out to the world in GBIF, there's not a whole heck of a lot we can do. However, there are, some occasionally small funding programs that emerge from GBIF that, if it's a question of finances or technical capacity, why that has not yet happened, there are resources for those collections to get underway. So they don't, unfortunately, have an immediate view or an immediate window into what we can do here over this next little while in this workshop. But I hope that if you know of those folk, put some indication of that in the shared notes for our workshop here, and we'll try and connect the dots and discover what is that they might need to get underway.
Yeah, so hopefully too, Gabor, and I think he just had to leave. He sent a note saying he's going to work on. Oh no, you're still here, Gabor. So you're still here, or you're not? I still see you. You are going to work on digitizing some bat collections in Europe. I don't know if it's the one. And Paul, I was wondering, can you get that data out? Can you share it with GBIF? Is there a reason that you're not sharing it with GBIF?
Only, it's just the amount of things to do in a number of people, so we publish.
Yes.
A lot of that data is published, is in papers, but it's not on GBIF, or I don't think it's on GBIF.
Okay.
I think one's either a GBIF person or not a GBIF person. I think a lot of it's published, but it's not. If you went to GBIF, you probably wouldn't find it, but it doesn't mean it's not. And a lot of these collections are quite important ones. So if I'm thinking, like Rhinolophid collections and Hipposideridae, I'm not sure what proportion would be in GBIF. I wouldn't say necessarily it's 90%. I'm not even sure it's 70%. And that's the only thing I'm saying is that when this, you're only capturing. There's a lot there not captured, I guess.
I'm sure. Well, hopefully you can be helpful in part of that. And I know Gabor might want to say a word or two, but they have a grant to work on some of the European Rhinolophid and Hipposideridae collections.
Yeah, very shortly, we have an estimation of 20,000 rhinolophids, but only those institutions can be involved which are part of the so-called synthesis project, which means only 9 institutions participate in this project. So unfortunately, no other European collections can be involved. So that is the problem, of course. So it is again question of the finances and the monetary support. Yeah.
Sure. But the nice thing is that we are talking with each other, and we are planning to share things like the outcomes of this workshop will greatly then help Gabor and the others. Christiana, are you here? I think you were here earlier. Help, and Roberto, when they go to start digitizing their bat collections, knowing who these people are and having these definitive records of where they were and when will help them georeference, for example. It will help them know that they've got the right specimens. It may help them with data that they may have that's missing. So it begins to be a network, and
No,
begins
I think it's
to
brilliant. It's a
connect.
brilliant start. It's brilliant, I think. Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah. So we're into we had that 15-minute segment we had set aside from 11 to 11:15 for questions, which we have now done. And I know that many of you need to do other things. So you had given us an hour of your day. We are now welcome to stay. We have this room set up for general help. We have breakout rooms, which you can join. There's one for strings, which is the GBIF agent strings. Who in the heck are these people? We have no idea. Task. And the other one is for things if you're going to work on the known people list. And that way you'll have help all day. We're around, we're here if you need us. Yes, please. I will, thank you, David. Stop the recording now.